Hi, I'm Karen and I'm a Burren Bio conservation volunteer and a walk coordinator. And I'm from the Netherlands. Now, if you know anything about the Netherlands, is that it's completely flat, as a pancake. So ever since I was a child, I'm completely obsessed with anything that has to do with mountains. So I ended up living here in Ireland in the Burren, and lucky for me, within my 5 kilometer radius even, there is a mountain. It's called Mullaghmore, and um, we are at Mullaghmore at the moment. So we're halfway through May, and it's spectacular to see how many flowers are in bloom at the moment. So when I thought about which one will I pick to talk about today, I thought I'll do mountain aven. You know, mountains. So mountain aven is right here, and if you look closely at it, you can see it has 8 petals. Now it's a member of the rose family, and normally rose family members have 5 petals, so it's quite special. And it can even have more than 8 petals sometimes if you look for them. You can also see these lovely golden stamens sticking out. I just think it's a beautiful flower. It also has these tiny dark green leathery leaves, and the leaves kind of look like miniature oak leaves. I think they're beautiful as well. Um, the plant almost never grows higher than 8 centimeters, but it just makes this lovely carpet, and you can see it everywhere around at the moment. It's beautiful. So mountain aven is one of these plants that we call Arctic alpine plants. That means you can find them in the mountains of Europe and also in the Arctic regions. But because of the special geology of the Burren, you can also find them thriving here, right here in the Burren. And I think that's really cool. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Burren Bio Trust and all the other people that are keeping the Burren in the best form possible for mountain aven and all the other special flowers to thrive. And I hope you're really enjoying Burren in Bloom, and much love from me, from Mullaghmore.
Hello everybody, my name is Neil Euchen and I'm here at my parents' farm at Lochavala, just up the green road at the edge of the Burren National Park. And at the moment I'm sitting here in this old Atlantic hazel woodland with many mature hazel trees, a few ash trees, even a few willows, but in particular behind me this old whitethorn tree. But there's actually another woody plant here growing on this whitethorn tree, and this is Hedera helix, or the common ivy as we would all recognize it. And ivy really is very common here in the landscape, growing very well either creeping on the forest floor or growing up living or non-living structures. And here you can see how it's crept up and really integrated itself with the trunk of this whitethorn tree in a very intimate and beautiful way. But ivy has a fantastic value for nature and biodiversity, namely in that it produces two things. Nectar but also berries at times of year when they would otherwise be very hard to come by in the landscape for wildlife. So when ivy flowers in autumn, it produces these umbrella-like inflorescences with green, pale yellowish flowers, and these produce abundant sources of nectar, very rich nectars. And these are very, very great for pollinating insects that are still foraging at that time of year, because of course most flowers have flowered and set seed by then. There's even in slightly warmer parts of Europe a specialized bee, Colletes hedera, which is the ivy bee, which has timed its life cycle entirely around the flowering period of ivy. It's also ivy is very beneficial for beekeepers, including myself, because it helps bee colonies overwinter successfully, because the flowering period comes at such a critical time of year in autumn when the bees are preparing to overwinter, and they stock up their colonies with this ivy nectar. Furthermore, of course, once it's been pollinated, it sets into seed production. And these seeds are contained in these berries which I'm holding here. These are extremely nutritious for birds, and these ripen towards the end of winter as spring approaches, at a critical time when birds are preparing for the coming nesting season. So these provide a fantastic food source for many species of birds at that time of year. Also, of course, the fact that it is an evergreen plant, it always provides cover, and when it's tangled up in canopies of mature trees, it provides a fantastic nesting site again for birds, and also a source of shelter or hibernation for many invertebrates and insects within the landscape. So ivy really is a very, very valuable tree, valuable woody plant, flowering plant, sorry, in the landscape, which is actually sometimes overlooked as a species and even blamed for certain things quite harshly. So yeah, I would definitely put it on my favorites list of native flowering plants here in the Burren.
Hi, my name is Brendan Dunford and I'm here to tell you about my favourite plant as part of Burn and Bloom 2020. The plant I've chosen is a little one called yellow rattle, here in my hand and all around us in this beautiful meadow. Yellow rattle is a parasitic plant. It taps into the roots of other plants, takes their energy and flourishes as a result. And the reason it gets its name, yellow rattle, is that when the seed pods dry out, they rattle in the wind like a little baby's rattle. I like this plant because it tells a story. Farmers in the Burren used to tell me that if you found this plant in a meadow, or if you heard it in a load of hay coming home, it was a sign of a poorly fertilised meadow that needed a bit of work. And I suppose that is true, because by having this plant in your meadow like here, it reduces the fertility and the productivity. And that's quite interesting, because as a farmer you really don't want a meadow full of this, because it suppresses growth, so you can't keep as many cattle and produce as much hay from this grassland. But for those of us who love nature, and I know there's many of us around the world, including an awful lot of farmers who do, having this plant here is a gateway to biodiversity, because it allows other plants, other herbs, orchids and clovers to prosper in the grassland as a result. So I love having it here. This meadow hasn't been reseeded in years, doesn't get heavily fertilised, and it's cut for hay. So little yellow rattle here gets a chance to seed every year and to expand. So it's fantastic. Now, I think what's really interesting about the yellow rattle is it tells us a story about conservation. If we want to conserve these, we have to find a balance between farming and nature. And that's quite difficult to do, because if you're a farmer, you've got to make a living, you've got to produce as much as you can from the farm, from the grassland, and that's how you get rewarded. But then, if you do that too much, you start to lose this biodiversity. So in the Burren programme, we've been pioneering an approach whereby farmers are paid for the presence of these wonderful rare plants now, as a way of rewarding them for managing the land in this way, and as a way of compensating them for the income foregone. And I think it's really that kind of a balance that we need to achieve between the need for food production, healthy, nutritious food, for the farmer to make a good living, and also for society to enjoy this wonderful biodiversity and for our nature to prosper as a result. So yellow rattle is the plant that I have chosen. Keep an eye out for it. It's a stunning plant with the yellow flower and a beautiful little blue tip on it. So yellow rattle.
Hi, my name is Phoebe Larkin. I'm a guide in the Burren National Park. We're here today in the Burren National Park to introduce you to the fly orchid, one of my favourites. An expert in floral mimicry. It's can have up to 10 flowers, resembling an insect, flying insect. Even though the flowers look like flies, it's actually the digger wasp that pollinates it. So not only does it look like an insect, it's excreting a pheromone type scent that attracts the male digger wasp, and it smells like the female digger wasp. And the male will try and mate with it, collecting pollen and pollinate other flowers. And if you look closely there, it's got some pseudo eyes to help it look like an insect. It's also got this bluish patch here which resembles wings shimmering in the light. Really stunning little orchid, not rare in Ireland but happy here in the Burren, and flowering from May to June. Enjoy, fly orchid.
Hi, good morning. My name's Terry Shoesmith and I garden with my husband Alan on a half-acre site on the East Burren. A lot of people have asked me when they've come here for garden visits or open days, how do you start? If you have a new house or a house that's never had any gardening done in it, how would you start to create a garden that's friendly for wildlife but also a really nice place for you and your family to relax? So I just want to show you how we started here, just the first area that we developed, and then you can see how you would break it down into bite-sized pieces. So when we moved to this house, there wasn't much here. It was mostly laid to grass. there were about a dozen small saplings, 4 of which are here. The 2 white beams, the greyish trees, and the bronze maple and the bronze cherry over there. And then there were another half dozen or so dotted around the garden. And that was really all. Though, apart from that, there was just grass, and there was a herbaceous bed in front that was planted to low maintenance shrubs, some of which were really good for wildlife, but there wasn't very much that was going to attract a wide variety, a wide biodiversity of species at all. So where did we start? Well, we started small. The first thing we did was to put some infrastructure in place. Wildlife needs pretty much the same things that we do, any species of wildlife, be an amphibian, a bird, a mammal or an insect. They need something to eat, they need plenty to eat, they need sheltered, safe places to make a home for their young, and then they need somewhere to raise their young, so they need food for their young, which is often not the same food that they eat themselves. So you need to think about providing all of those different things. So we started off with these 4 trees, and I have a theory. We decided to develop the beds around them. Well, the first thing we did, was to plant a native hedge around 2 sides of the garden. So you can see it's a mixture of white beam, blackthorn, whitethorn, blackthorn, spindle, Guelder rose, wild rose, and a few other species as well. There's a couple of rowan trees in there and a couple of maples too. So that has been growing on for the last 9 years, and it's now a nice thick prickly hedge which is very safe and provides an awful lot of food for a lot of caterpillars, a lot of insect larvae, a lot of insects themselves for the young for the chicks, which are being raised in nest boxes and nests around the garden now. So we started off then, after that, we created these beds around the trees and planted more trees and shrubs in the beds. And I have a theory about wildlife gardening, that if you keep the edges of the beds very neat, if you keep them clipped, as you can just see here to my right, you can just see round the edge of this little bed here, you can see it's all very neatly shaped and clipped. So if you do that, then you can have all kinds of weeds, wildflowers in the bed, and nobody will be any the wiser. It looks very carefully maintained. So that's my tip for good wildlife gardening: keep the edges neat and you can create all sorts of mayhem within the bed. So the second thing we did then, after we planted these, was to put in the pond. And the pond is probably the single most useful thing you can have in your garden. Now, you don't, if you've small children, then that might not be a very good idea. So you don't have to have a pond. You can have something like this, which is just a pump which pumps water up there, and it comes out of the spout there and it just trickles back down again. You don't have to have a deep pond. It's not very safe, that pond, for very small kids. You can just use something like this, a big 8-gallon weed bucket, a tub. So you sink it at the bottom there, you fill it up with big stones, put your pump in it, and that works just as well. You can get very small varieties of pond plants as well, so have a look out for those. And if you put those in there, then you could even get tadpoles growing in it. So that's my tip if you don't want a pond. Now, if you look at the big pond, you can see that the edges are quite wild, and that's deliberate, because when the young of the frogs and newts, and when they come in and out of the pond, they don't stay in the pond all the time. They come to the pond to breed, and then they come in and out. So when they crawl out of the pond, they've got plenty of shelter there, and then from there it's only a quick hop across to the borders, and they're safe then, and they're safe from predators. So they need that slightly wild area around the pond as well. So when you're buying plants, the generally accepted wisdom is that you want to have open flowers, like these on this little orange geum here, because they're very good for the bees, and they are. But the thing you have to remember about insects is that lots of different pollinating insects have different length tongues, so they need lots of different kinds of flowers. They don't all need exactly the same kind of flower. So the trick is to go round to the garden centre and have a look at what the bees are feeding on in the garden centre, and then buy those. The problem with that is you've now got your pond or a water source for birds to bathe and for amphibians to breed in. So you've now got your pond, you've got your trees, which are safe for the insects or the birds to scope out. So you're bringing in the bats, you're bringing in the birds, you've probably got mammals running up and down here. So the next thing you have to think about is you've got plenty of things for the adult insects to eat, plenty of nectar producing plants. But that's not really enough. If you have that, then it's effectively like sending a whole load of food over to a starving population in Africa, but not sending any baby milk. So you're feeding the adults, but if you're not going to feed the larvae, then that population is going to die out, which is exactly what's happening to our birds now. As we're going into monocultures, then the variety of wild plants is declining and declining and declining, and there just isn't anything for the larvae to feed on, so they can't reproduce properly. So that's where your meadow comes in. We were very lucky when we moved here that we had all of this acreage, all of this half acre, and it had been really just mowed for the previous 20 odd years, and it had never been sprayed with any kind of chemicals or weed killers or moss killer or anything like that. So we had an enormous variety of wild plants in the garden, like all of these plantains, oxeye daisies. There were probably at the last count about 200 orchids. And if you just look down here, you can see an ant's nest. And ants are a great and wonderful thing. People try to get rid of them, but they don't really do much harm in the garden, and they're a great thing if you're trying to establish a wildflower meadow, because they carry orchid seeds around, so they'll spread your orchids. We started off with 9, we've now got upwards of 200. We've done nothing to produce this at all. The Burren has done it all by itself, as the Burren does very well, as we all know. So the other thing is that all of these plants in the garden, an awful lot of them are the food plants for the larvae of various insects. I should just mention that up at the far end of the garden as well, we have compost heaps. We have a big bed of nettles up there and a whole pile of sticks for things to overwinter in, for invertebrates to overwinter in. And the nettles are currently covered in caterpillars, a small tortoiseshell and peacock butterflies. So if you've space for nettles somewhere where nobody's going to see them, they're not the prettiest or the nicest smelling plants, but if you can accommodate them somewhere, so much the better. I just want to show you this little plant as well. That small yellow plant there that you can see in the patches throughout this meadow is bird's foot trefoil, and it's one of the most valuable wildlife plants we have because an awful lot of insect larvae feed on it. So if you've got a meadow, you can just let a patch of grass, an area of grass, grow up and see what happens. This is the easiest gardening we ever do. We mow it or trim it once a year, usually around the end of August, September. And then the cuttings are all taken up, the cut material is taken up, piled in a big heap down the bottom of the garden. That's also a wonderful space for things to overwinter in safely, and then it can rot down to its heart's content. And then that takes away the fertility. You don't want fertility in your meadow. You want it to be as poor soil as you possibly can get. So, and that way, that encourages the plants, the grass or the pollinating plants, as opposed to the grass. So the grass is gradually declining every year, and we've got more and more flowers coming. So apart from that, I mean, that's just basically my advice. Plant a hedge, plant some trees, good pollinating plants, but most of all probably plants for insect larvae, shelter for wildlife as well. So that's my advice, and I would just say happy gardening, break it down into bite-sized bits. So happy gardening, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.